Welcome to another audit walkthrough video from SuperfastCPA. I'm Logan, and in today's video, we're going to be going over Audit Area 2. This is Section E. This is an application topic. Determine appropriate procedures to assess the operating effectiveness of relevant controls. And we're going to be doing that the SuperfastCPA way, which is diving straight into the questions to learn the material. Now, if you don't know much about our strategies, make sure you go to SuperfastCPA.com and sign up for our free 1-hour webinar training. Again, it's free, it's 1 hour, and we will teach you in that 1 hour the key ingredients to passing the CPA exam so you don't waste months or even years of your time. So make sure you check that out. Also, just letting you know, we will only be going over 5 questions in today's video, but SuperfastCPA Pro members will get access to the full 10-question version of the video when we post it in the members forum. So if you want a little bit more help and a little bit more understanding, make sure you check out becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member because again, they will get access to the full 10-question version of this video. Now with that, let's dive straight into the questions. All right, here we are at question 1. And something I always like to point out, now it might not seem super effective in this question, but this is a very good habit to be in no matter what. You want to read the last part of the question first so that you understand what the question is trying to get at. Again, it might not be super helpful in this situation because it's just 2 sentences, but again, I still want you to be thinking of this as a habit because this is something that will help you a ton on test day. Imagine you see a paragraph or 2-paragraph question, and instead of reading through all of it and then at the very end kind of understanding what the question is even asking, you read the last part of the question first, which will give you context, and then you read through the rest of the question, kind of already knowing what you should be looking for. So again, let's do this just to be in the habit. Which of the following procedures provides the most reliable evidence regarding a control's operating effectiveness? Let's go up to the top. An auditor is testing the operating effectiveness of a client's internal controls. Which of the following procedures provides the best reliable evidence? Okay, so let's walk through the options. Option A, inquiry of personnel responsible for performing the control. Option B, observation of the control being performed and inspection of related documentation. Option C, discussing the control with management and reviewing internal policies. Or option D, reviewing prior year audit documentation to confirm the control's continued existence. Okay, so again, out of these different options, which one of them is the most reliable when it comes to getting evidence for the operating effectiveness of a control? Now, if you don't really know how to test for operating effectiveness, that's okay. You might not know the answer. If not, that's okay. We are going to use this question and the questions in this video to learn this topic. So let's go ahead and dive into the explanation to start learning. All right, here we are. The answer is B, observation of the control being performed and inspection of related documentation. So let's dive into the explanation. When assessing the operating effectiveness of controls, auditors use procedures such as inquiry, observation, inspection, recalculation related to a control, and reperformance. So those are the 5 that you need to remember, that these are how you test operating effectiveness of controls. So we're going to repeat that all throughout the video. So again, inquiry, observation, inspection, recalculation, specifically when it comes to recalculating for the control, and reperformance. While inquiry can provide useful information, and that was obviously option A, it is not sufficient on its own because it relies on the response of personnel without direct evidence of how the control is actually performed. More reliable evidence comes from directly observing the control in action, inspecting documentation that supports its operation, and in some cases, testing the control through reperformance or recalculation. Reviewing prior year audit documentation does not confirm whether the control is currently operating effectively. So option A was incorrect because you can't just have inquiry. Option C was incorrect because just talking with management and reviewing the internal control policies, again, that's kind of more close to inquiry. But the most reliable in this situation is observing the control being performed and inspecting the related documentation. So, option C was close, but it is better to, instead of just talking to management, to actually see the control in action. So that's why answer B was correct. Now, with that, we've learned a little bit about how to test for operating effectiveness. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 2. And again, we're reading the last part first. Which of the following is the best approach for the auditor to take? Let's go up to the top. An auditor is evaluating the effectiveness of a company's cash disbursement approval process. The control requires that a manager review and approve all disbursements above a certain threshold before payment is issued. The auditor wants to obtain the most reliable evidence regarding whether this control is functioning as designed. So again, which of the following is the best approach for the auditor to take? Let's go through the options. Option A, observing the manager reviewing and approving disbursements before payments are made. Option B, inquiring of the manager about how they review and approve disbursements. Option C, performing analytical procedures to identify unusual cash disbursement patterns. Or option D, confirming cash disbursements with vendors to verify payment amounts. So based on what we learned in the first question and maybe your other knowledge, you might be able to figure this one out. So pause the video, think through this, and when you're ready, come back, we'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is A, observing the manager reviewing and approving disbursements before payments are made. So based on what we learned in the first question, it makes sense that observing would be better than just inquiring or performing analytical procedures. And we'll learn a little bit more about analytical procedures throughout this video. But Let's go into the explanation. To assess the operating effectiveness of controls, and I'm going to repeat this multiple times, auditors use procedures such as inquiry, observation, inspection, recalculation related to a control, and reperformance. Observation provides strong evidence in this scenario because it allows the auditor to see whether the manager is consistently reviewing and approving disbursements before payments are issued. Inquiry, that was option B, can provide useful insight, but is not sufficient on its own because it relies on verbal confirmation rather than direct evidence. And something you'll pretty much always see as correct is observation is almost always better evidence than just inquiry. Analytical procedures, and that was option C, help identify trends or anomalies, but do not directly test the control's operation. Confirmations, and that was option D, verify payment amounts, but do not assess whether approvals occurred before payments were made. So again, those other ones are important things, but they are not testing the operating effectiveness of the control directly like option A is. Now with that, let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 3. Which of the following is not required when obtaining an understanding of a company's internal controls? So let's walk through this. Option A, testing the operating effectiveness of controls through observation and reperformance. Option B, evaluating the design of controls to determine whether they are capable of preventing or detecting material misstatements. Option C, identifying the types of potential misstatements that could arise from control deficiencies. Or option D, understanding how transactions are initiated, processed, and recorded within the company's information system. So again, which one of these is not something that the auditor has to do to obtain an understanding of the company's internal controls? Now, if you have no idea, that's okay. But if you kind of have a general idea of how to obtain an understanding, maybe based on what you've learned in your review course, or maybe from one of our previous videos, then you might be able to pause the video and think through this and get the correct answer. If not, that's okay. We're going to look at the answer together right now. All right, here we are. The answer is A, testing the operating effectiveness of controls through observation and reperformance is not something you have to do to obtain an understanding of the company's internal controls. So let's walk through this. And this is relevant because, we're learning about how to determine operating effectiveness and things like that, but this is one of the moments where this is not the correct time to be doing it. When obtaining an understanding of internal controls, auditors focus on evaluating the design of controls and determining whether they have been implemented. So just whether they've been implemented, like are they active? This includes identifying potential misstatements, that was option C, and understanding transaction flows, that was option D. However, testing the operating effectiveness, so not just implementation, but effectiveness of controls, and that's option A, is not required at this stage. Operating effectiveness is only tested when the auditor intends to rely on controls to reduce substantive testing, and we're going to learn about substantive testing in the next question. Understanding a control's design does not require testing whether it consistently functions as intended. So again, you do not have to test the operating effectiveness of a control when you're gaining an understanding of the internal controls of a company. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Now let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 4. Which of the following procedures would provide the best evidence of the control's effectiveness? Let's go up to the top. An auditor is evaluating the effectiveness of a company's inventory controls, which require warehouse personnel to document inventory transfers in a tracking system immediately after movement. The auditor wants to obtain evidence that this control is operating effectively. So again, which of the following procedures would provide the best evidence of the control's effectiveness? Let's walk through the options. Option A, perform a physical inventory count and reconciling it to the general ledger. Option B, comparing inventory turnover ratios across multiple periods to identify unusual trends. Option C, inspecting inventory transfer records to verify that entries were made immediately after movement. And then option D, confirming inventory balances with suppliers to verify quantities. So again, which one of these is the best procedure to receive the best evidence of this control's effectiveness? Now, based on what we've learned, you might be able to pause the video and think through this. If not, that's okay. We're going to learn from the explanation. But again, pause the video if you want to, and when you're ready, come back. We'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is C, inspecting inventory transfer records to verify that entries were made immediately after movement. So that would be the best in this situation. Let's walk through this. Auditors use tests of controls to assess whether a control is operating effectively. These include inquiry, observation, inspection, recalculation related to a control, and reperformance. So we learned something very important there. When you are testing controls, a test of control is inquiry, observation, inspection, recalculation, and reperformance. Inspecting inventory transfer records provides direct evidence of whether warehouse personnel are following the control by documenting transfers as required. So that is one of the 5 things that we've talked about in this video, and that is a test of control. Now, we've talked about substantive procedures and analytical procedures throughout multiple videos, but we've never really dived into what they really are. What is a substantive procedure? What is an analytical procedure? Because it hasn't been extremely relevant in the other videos, but it has a lot to do with this video because there is a difference between tests of controls and substantive procedures and analytical procedures. So let's dive into the other 2 paragraphs. In contrast, substantive procedures focus on verifying financial statement amounts, rather than control effectiveness. Performing a physical inventory count, and that was option A, and confirming inventory balances, that was option D. Test whether inventory is recorded accurately, but do not assess whether the control over inventory transfers is functioning. So there is that difference where substantive procedures, you're just verifying balances and things like that, whereas with a test of controls, you are testing to see if a control specifically is working, and they're not doing the same thing. Analytical procedures, and that was option B, involve evaluating financial data by identifying trends, ratios, or fluctuations. These procedures may help detect potential control deficiencies, but do not provide direct evidence that a control is functioning as intended. Analytical procedures are typically used for risk assessment or as a form of substantive testing rather than for testing controls. So again, we didn't talk about it an extreme amount, but now we finally kind of understand a little bit the difference between substantive procedures, analytical procedures, and tests of controls. And the whole point of this video is tests of controls to learn the operating effectiveness of the controls. But substantive procedures are not the same thing. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. In this situation, because the other ones are just verifying balances and things like that, they are substantive procedures, making them not tests of controls, so they would not be effective in this situation. Now with that, we learned a little bit more. Let's go to the next question. All right, here we are at question 5. In which of the following situations can the auditor continue to rely on prior testing without performing new tests of operating effectiveness? So let's go up to the top. An auditor tested a company's cash disbursement approval controls in the prior audit and found them to be effective. The auditor plans to rely on these controls again for the current audit. In which of the following situations can the auditor continue to rely on prior testing without performing new tests of operating effectiveness? So let's walk through the options. Option A, the control was last tested 3 years ago and was determined to be operating effectively at that time. Option B, the company changed its approval workflow to require an additional level of authorization. Option C, the company switched to a new accounts payable software that processes disbursements differently. Or option D, the controls and the underlying data used in the control have not changed since the prior audit. Okay, so we haven't really learned much about this kind of situation. If you want, pause the video and think through this and think through, which one of these sounds like it would be most logically the correct answer. But if you don't know, that's okay. We're going to use this explanation to learn. So pause the video if you want to, and if you're ready, come back, we'll look at the answer together. All right, here we are. The answer is D, the controls and the underlying data used in the control have not changed since the prior audit. So let's walk through this. If an auditor plans to rely on controls, they may use prior year testing results only if the controls and the underlying data have not changed, and that was option D. However, if there have been any changes to the controls themselves or the data they rely on, the auditor must perform new tests to assess their continued effectiveness. So let's talk about the other options and why they would probably require new testing. So option A, if a control was tested 3 years ago, and that kind of contradicts what was said in the question, so that makes sense why this one is wrong. But again, if a control was tested 3 years ago, the auditor must retest it in the current audit to rely on it as prior testing results become outdated. Again, maybe if it was in the previous year, like it kind of mentions in the question, then maybe not. But 3 years ago, a lot can change in 3 years. You can't just assume that for 3 years straight, something is effective because things haven't necessarily changed. After a while, you do need to start retesting to make sure that it's still effective. Option B, adding an extra approval step changes the control, meaning the auditor must test it again. So if the control changes, you have to retest it. Option C, a new accounts payable system affects how transactions are processed, requiring the auditor to verify that controls still function properly. So in the other situations, the auditor would most likely have to retest the control, even though in the previous year, in the prior audit, it seemed okay. Auditors cannot assume a control remains effective without confirming that both the control and the data it relies on have remained unchanged. So again, as long as they haven't changed very much and a long time hasn't passed, then they might be able to rely on it. But if any of those other things that we talked about happen, then they would probably need to retest the control to make sure that it's still effective. Now with that, we learned a lot about the operating effectiveness of controls and how you test that. Before we do anything else, let's do one more part of the SuperfastCPA process called pillar topics. Now the idea behind pillar topics is as you're going through the questions to learn the material, you will notice the things that keep popping up. You've seen 2 or 3 or 4 questions trying to teach you specifically about the 5 different ways that you can test operating effectiveness of controls. Remember, we went over that multiple times. Or whatever the case is. Again, these are the things you notice the most in the questions. And as you're doing this, and at the end of your studying, you write out these pillar topics in your own words so that you know what is most important for test day. And as you're doing this each day, you're building your own personal repository of the most important things you learned from the questions so that you know them for test day. You're writing them in your own words so that you're very prepared when it comes to exam day. Now with that, let's go ahead and look at the pillar topics for this video. All right, here we are at the pillar topics. Let's just dive straight in. Ways to test control effectiveness. That's the first pillar topic. Auditors assess the operating effectiveness of controls using, and again, we mentioned this multiple times, inquiry, observation, inspection, recalculation related to a control, and reperformance. Inquiry alone is not sufficient because it lacks direct evidence. You can have inquiry as part of it, but it is something that cannot be alone when it comes to testing control effectiveness. Now let's talk about tests of control versus substantive and analytical procedures. And again, this is the first time we've really dived into what a substantive procedure even is. Tests of controls, and that's what we were talking about in this video, assess whether a control is operating effectively, while substantive procedures, and that includes tests of details and analytical procedures, focus on verifying financial statement balances. Analytical procedures help identify trends but do not directly test control operation. And just to make sure that that's clear, analytical procedures can be a substantive test and they can be something on their own. So just making sure there's no confusion there. But again, just to make it totally clear, substantive tests where you're testing account balances and things like that are not the same thing as testing control effectiveness. Now let's talk about the next one, understanding controls versus testing effectiveness. When obtaining an understanding of internal controls, auditors evaluate their design and implementation, seeing if they are designed and if they're even being implemented at all, but they do not test their operating effectiveness. Testing effectiveness is only required if the auditor plans to rely on controls to reduce substantive testing. Now let's talk about the final one, retesting controls when changes occur. If an auditor plans to rely on controls, like we just mentioned, they must test their operating effectiveness in the current audit if the controls or the underlying data they rely on have changed since they were last tested. Prior year testing can only be relied upon if no changes have occurred. So we kind of went over the pillar topics. Again, those were the most important things that you were supposed to have learned from those 5 questions. Now, that is the end of this video. That is the end of the YouTube version of the video. But remember, we only went over 5 questions today, but SuperfastCPA CPA Pro members will get access to the full 10-question version of the video when we post it in the members forum. So if you like this and you like our other videos, make sure you go to SuperfastCPA.com and check out becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member, because SuperfastCPA Pro members, again, get access to the full versions of these videos, and they get access to something called the Pro Course, where Nate explains in detail exactly what you're supposed to be doing every single day to pass these exams. Again, it's kind of like a much more expanded version of the 1-hour webinar. And speaking of the webinar, that is by far the easiest way to really go learn a lot more about SuperfastCPA and get introduced to becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member. So go to SuperfastCPA.com, sign up for the free 1-hour webinar, and again, that will give you a great path to learning more about SuperfastCPA and becoming a SuperfastCPA Pro member if you decide to do that. Now, if you liked this video, make sure to like it and leave a comment. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in the next video.